Okay, so the Uptime Institute, you've recently published a report, and I'll have to read this, excuse me, but public cloud costs versus resiliency, stateless applications. And that's focusing on the importance of cloud service resiliency. So can you perhaps tell us what that concept is and why it is so important?
Sure. So I think there's a bit of confusion about what cloud is and isn't. And I don't think cloud is just someone else's computer sat in someone else's data center. It's a total shift in IT procurement, and a lot of the rules of the game are now different. And I joined Uptime about 8 months ago, and really I want to help users understand how the cloud model differs in practice to traditional on-premises infrastructure. And one of the big ways it differs is who's in charge of resiliency. So in cloud, the user is primarily responsible for architecting resiliency in their applications. So it's not enough to just put your application on the cloud and assume it'll be highly available. The user has to almost design the resiliency into their application from the very core. Now, obviously, this costs money. So in this report, I try to unravel how resiliency of the application varies with cost.
Okay, so in simple terms, I guess you're saying that for the end user, it's critical that they understand what it is or isn't, that what they aren't being offered by the cloud when it comes to, I guess, cutting through all the nonsense. Application availability is what really matters to them. And as you say, they might assume I've gone to the cloud, therefore whoever's cloud it is, they'll sort my problems out. But that's not the case. They need to understand which bits of the infrastructure under the app are their responsibility and which may or may not be the cloud, yeah?
Totally, totally. Who is responsible for what? What does the provider look after? What does the user look after? And even though it sounds like these things should be obvious, as you said, there's a lot of nonsense and confusion about it. Some cloud services, such as load balancers, the cloud provider would manage a lot of the resiliency. But for other services, such as virtual machines, which are the core of the cloud, resiliency is down for the user to manage. So even though you would think these things are easy to understand, when you get into the core of cloud, things vary by provider and by service, and it's really difficult to nail down who has to do what.
And did the report uncover or anecdotally, are you able to share any idea as to what end users, the difference between what end users maybe think they've got and the reality? I mean, do they often get shocked and think, oh, I thought my cloud provider's doing that and now I've got a problem? Or what did you uncover?
So cloud providers, in fairness to them, are pretty upfront that availability zones, which are effectively data centers, they will go down occasionally. So they say that you should build applications that span multiple availability zones, so multiple data centers. So if one data center goes down, the other data center can still carry on and the application should still run. And in this year's Uptime Institute annual survey, we asked our respondents who was primarily responsible for an application outage should one of these zones go down. Is it primarily the user's fault or the cloud provider's fault? And the result was a genuine 50-50 split. So what this means is 50% of our respondents expect their applications to run seamlessly, but haven't architected this basic resiliency that the cloud providers are recommending. So there's a huge chasm between what users are expecting and what they're probably getting in reality.
Okay, and the good news is that it might cost a bit of money, but there are various ways of improving that, the balance of resilience, the expense of that, the outage compensation, maybe even you get from cloud providers, and depending on how sophisticated you want to get, the most basic, if I call it that, is a sort of machine level protection. So can you sort of outline what that is, what benefits that would bring?
Yeah, so as you said, the simplest way to have resiliency is to build your application so you have two virtual machines and data is being distributed them via the means of a load balancer. So if one of these virtual machines should happen to go down, the user should notice because the other virtual machine should be able to take up the slack. Okay,
and those, if I understand it correctly, may well still be in the same physical location. Therefore, the sort of next level up is machine level protection, but also some zone protection. Does that mean you're physically separating two different machines? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly that. So if both virtual machines are in the same availability zone and the data center goes down, obviously they're both going to go offline. And as I mentioned, the cloud providers are pretty upfront that these zones are going to go down from time to time. So you can improve your resiliency by putting each virtual machine in a different zone. And the good news is this costs no more than locating the virtual machines in the same zone, but it does increase the monthly availability, typically up to maybe 99.99%.
Okay, and then moving sort of up the resiliency stack, if you like, we've got active failover zone level resiliency. So what does that mean, or what does that add?
So if you're really price sensitive and you want to squeeze costs, you could have one of the virtual machines active in one zone doing the day job and another virtual machine in a failover region, or a failover zone rather. So if the active zone fails, the reserve machine can be started up, and this saves money because you don't have to pay for the computing resources of the failover zone when it's not in use. But the downside is you have to wait for that failover zone to start up, and that can take 15 minutes. It also means you're relying on the cloud provider to have that capacity there when you need it. And that might not be the case, because if a whole zone goes down, there might be tens of thousands of applications which are being shifted to the other zone. And if there's a lot of demand for capacity there, the capacity you need might not be available when you need it.
Okay, and then I think sort of top of the tree, and no doubt with a price tag to match to a certain extent, but you've got region, zone, and machine levels. So what is that that's the optimum solution, and what does that add to what you've already described?
So as you said, it's the most expensive solution, about twice the cost of a non-resilient application. And in this module, virtual machines aren't just balanced across data centers, they're balanced across totally geographical regions, and the cloud providers call these regions. And the result is very high availability of many nines, but quantifying the exact resiliency is impossible because we don't have visibility into the cloud data center resiliency. So we can say that it is more resilient than building across availability zones, but we don't actually know how much more resilient. It's too difficult to measure.
Okay, and then I guess the challenge for the customer, the end user, is then to carry out an appraisal of each application as to how critical that is to their business, and therefore how much money they might want to spend on the various levels of resilience. I mean, clearly every business is different, but is there any kind of easy or standard way of trying to work out the financial reputation? I mean, there's still a lot of intangibles, but any thoughts on that?
I mean, as you said, it all depends on the application and the nature of the application. If you've got a mission critical application which the whole business relies on, it generates huge amounts of revenue, then paying a little bit more to have resiliency, I mean, it's going to pale into insignificance. Who's going to care if you're paying a bit more for cloud if it means that your business is sustainable and continue to attract revenue? But if the application is not critical, if it's a Minecraft Wikipedia page, then why bother paying all that money for resiliency if it's not going to derive a lot of value for the organization?
Okay, and in terms of the report's sort of findings, that there were some interesting things you discovered, and I think that perhaps one of the most relevant for people to sort of get their brains around is that cloud native applications are an important way of adding to your resiliency. Can you explain why, and I mean, how easy is it? And I'm guessing it possibly isn't, but we've got all these legacy apps that run on all manner of things, and ideally you want to rewrite them as you say, cloud native. But what's the practicalities of that, and why does it matter?
I mean, pretty much what you said. Picking up an application and dumping it in the cloud, it's unlikely to derive much real benefit. It's going to be a lot of work to just pick it up and dump it in, and the application is going to be the same as it was. It's not going to be able to grow and shrink to changing demands. It's not going to be able to get bigger when you have more users accessing it, or be able to scale dynamically when an availability zone goes down. So cloud applications need to be architected to be able to dynamically take advantage of more or less resources. So to do that, you need tools which lets your application grow up and down, but also to manage the complexity of this application. And that's what cloud native development is. It's the ability to build these applications which are dynamic and scalable, but also to keep track of what they're doing and to ensure they're secure and resilient.
So I'm just wondering, so if you migrate all your legacy applications and just dump them in the cloud, you get some benefit, but maybe it's still quite a risky approach compared to over a period of time re-engineering all your apps, writing them cloud native so that you obtain full benefits from cloud. Is that right?
Totally. I think as you alluded to, there needs to be a phased approach to this migration. There's going to be some applications which perhaps are easy to move to the cloud. They're already scalable in some respects. So you're going to get an instant benefit by moving them because it can take advantage of cloud scalability. There might be other applications which are mission critical, which would add a lot of value to the business by being made scalable. So they would be the next ones to move to cloud. And you'd have to, as you said, redesign them and re-architect them to be scalable. But there's going to be some applications which there's no clear advantage to move into the cloud right now. They're working fine where they are. There's not really a financial benefit in doing so. And they're probably fine where they are for the time being if there's no particular urgency. So I think organizations almost need to prioritize applications and prioritize based on how valuable is it to the business to move them to the cloud and how easy is it to re-architect them to be scalable.
Okay, and I know there were various other conclusions and sort of tips for users that the report produced. Can you, so I picked on the cloud native one as perhaps being one of the more important ones. What were some of the other sort of conclusions you drew and help for end users?
I think the biggest message I would want to communicate from this report is that users have to make sure their applications have resiliency built in. And as we've talked about a lot, you can't just move it to the cloud and expect it to be resilient. You have to do it. It's the user's job. The cloud providers have generally tried to make the use of availability zones pretty easy. So users should use them as a bare minimum. And I would also recommend having a failover to a different region too. Now, generally, whole regions don't go down very often, but they do go down. And if that does happen, by having a failover region, you can still fall back to that when things go really down.
Okay, and you'll be aware, as most of us are, that when cloud first hit, there was enormous hype, and we were all going to head there, and it was nirvana, no downsides. The reality is, people have begun to understand perhaps the true cost, and as what we're discussing, so achieving resiliency in the cloud is maybe no less expensive than if you do it on premise. So I guess the question is, do you think a lot of people rushed into the cloud because they thought it was a cheap and good way of guaranteeing some level of resilience, and when they actually discover what they do need to spend in the cloud to get a comparable solution to maybe what they were doing on-prem, the sums aren't necessarily as attractive to the cloud option? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think moving or migrating to the cloud should be about cost. It should be about the value of doing it to the organization. So for the right use case with an application that can scale up and down as needs dictate, obviously cloud can deliver huge value by capturing more revenue, better satisfying users, delivering productivity. And I think during COVID, when so many of us had to work from home and we were doing more and more things online, cloud enabled that a lot of the time by being able to scale applications up and down. I mean, thinking about how much streaming content I watched, a lot of that infrastructure was built on cloud, and there was value in doing it because it could scale up to satisfy more users' demand. But I don't think the return on investment of picking up an application from an on-prem data center and putting it in the cloud is clear. If the app can't scale or doesn't need to scale, then the value of cloud isn't obvious. Now, is cloud or on-prem cheaper? And this is a question I get asked literally all the time. And I'm afraid it all depends on the application. Some applications are going to be cheaper on the cloud, others aren't, which is why I think the decision should be based on value to the organization rather than just a cost-cutting exercise.
Okay, and I think you've almost answered my final question, but if you had any advice to end users as they, I guess, continue to wrestle with this sort of on-prem cloud and and how they evaluate. So, you know, there's purely the sums, but you're saying obviously there's operational benefits to be understood as well. I say, is there a spreadsheet, a list of things they can tick off as they go down and assess each application, or unfortunately, is it a bit more down to sort of, you know, somebody's been working there 20 years and has a pretty good sort of, you know, idea of what makes sense, or, you know, how scientific, I suppose, is what I'm saying, can you be as to the decisions around where to put your applications?
A lot of it comes down to how much is IT embedded into the organization. So if you are an organization, you realize IT is what's driving the business, then you need to use cloud in line with business objectives. So if your business objective is to increase revenue 10% over the year or something like that, then obviously you need to think about that when architecting your cloud services so that they can scale. But if you're a very siloed IT department, you might have other objectives, and that's where the cost cutting might come in. That's when you might decide that you don't necessarily want to add value, you just want to squeeze costs. So I think this is an organizational level discussion, and there are no quick fixes. But what I would say is, don't assume things. Cloud providers are all different, and in terms and conditions or in their product portfolios, things are very different. You have to investigate the options and work out different ways of doing things. And as you said, there might be someone who's been there for 20 years, who understands the applications, who understands the IT infrastructure, but you are going to need experts who can tell you what is cloud and what can it do for those applications. Because cloud is so fundamentally different, you almost can't just rest on your laurels, and you can't just rely on the people who've been there for a long time. You have to get experts who understand how fundamentally different everything is now.
And maybe just one final, in terms of the sort of meaning of resilience, it does make me chuckle sometimes. We reference legacy applications, and, you know, maybe they've been sat on a machine and nobody dares touch it. That doesn't sound very resilient, but you can semi-understand why they don't want to maybe move it to the cloud. But do you think most organizations really do understand the full sort of meaning of resilience, or are most companies, if they really start looking, find that there is actually perhaps, you know, one major potential bottleneck or point of failure that they just, for whatever reason, hadn't considered, that, you know, if somebody does this or that, it all, you know, collapses, even though they might have, you know, applications all over the world and think they've got resilience, but there's some fundamental problem. I guess, yeah, people's attitude to resilience, do you think they really grasp it?
That's a really interesting question. I bet there are loads of legacy applications, and I bet lots of companies have identified the resiliency risks. The question is what to do about it now without having to rebuild the application. So I think most enterprises have an understanding of resiliency and understand its importance. There's just perhaps a lot of applications that are so old or so important, they don't really know now how to solve the resilience issue. And I mean, something else I'm quite interested in is cloud has created lots of new options, lots of new products and services across different regions, but cloud is almost introducing its own level of complexity. You know, with cloud, there's more things that can go wrong because we're looking at such a massive distributed system. So the problem with resiliency is it's never black and white. And the more you investigate, the more things you can find that can go wrong. And in cloud, although there's a lot of tools to help build resiliency, as more and more users use cloud, are we going to see more and more issues caused by the complexity of the cloud service offerings out there?
Okay, and that's perhaps a conversation for another day, but I really enjoyed chatting to you, and thanks for some really thought-provoking answers. So, yeah, thanks for your time, Owen. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.